Hello students, welcome to you to this session. Last time we had discussed about the utility analysis. We had a little bit of an introduction to utility analysis and we became conversant with the concepts. Today we are going to take up a topic which is related to utility analysis. In fact, all utility analysis is for the understanding of demand or for the understanding of consumer behavior. There are two laws which support the law of demand, and they are known as the law of diminishing marginal utility and the law of equimarginal utility. Both these laws assume that utility can be measured cardinally, that is in absolute terms. And these two laws become the foundation stones for the law of demand or for the understanding of consumer behavior. And therefore, today we are going to take up the first law, the law of diminishing marginal utility. Earlier, many economists used utility analysis or used the law of diminishing marginal utility to explain different things, and ultimately it was also used in explaining consumer behavior. The law explains that as an individual consumes more and more of a commodity, each additional unit will give him lesser and lesser additional satisfaction. And this fact helps us to understand why there is an inverse relationship between price and demand. So let us try to understand this law. In fact, we would have to understand why there is diminishing utility. As you increase the quantity, why does marginal utility decrease from the additional units? This is what we have to understand. Now, suppose the marginal utility or the additional utility that a person gets out of the consumption of one more unit of a commodity increases. Then in such a case, all the income of the consumer would be spent only on one commodity. For example, if the subsequent unit gives a consumer a higher level of satisfaction compared to the previous unit, then he would go in and purchase one more unit. And as each subsequent unit goes on giving him more and more additional satisfaction, he would go on purchasing the same commodity. In fact, consumers try to compare the price that they are paying and the utility that they are deriving. In fact, we would have to substantiate and try to explain why marginal utility declines. As a consumer has more and more of a commodity, the additional units give him lesser and lesser satisfaction. Now, let us suppose that marginal utility increases rather than decreasing. In such a case, the consumer would go on purchasing the same item and spend all his income on a single commodity. For example, if the subsequent unit that he consumes gives him more satisfaction, more additional satisfaction than the previous unit, then he would go in for purchasing the same item as each subsequent unit gives him more and more satisfaction, more and more additional satisfaction. And we cannot justify this because we know that consumers purchase many items, they purchase many goods, and therefore this cannot happen. Marginal utility cannot increase as a person consumes more and more of the commodity. Now let us consider a case where the marginal utility derived from the commodity is constant. For example, if each additional unit gives the consumer the same additional amount of utility, then also we would not be able to justify this. For example, every consumer tries to compare what he is giving away and what he is getting, and therefore he tries to compare the utility that he derives with the price that he pays. And so if a person tries to purchase one more unit of a commodity, it means that he is getting more utility from the commodity than the price that he is paying for it. And therefore, if in the first instance a person purchased 1 unit of a commodity, it would mean that the price is lesser than the utility that he is deriving from that unit. And therefore, subsequently, when he buys the second unit, again the same thing would happen. He would be deriving more utility than the price that he is paying. And even if the marginal utility is constant, a consumer would tend to spend all his income on a single commodity. And therefore, marginal utility can neither increase nor can it remain constant. It has to diminish. This can be shown through a diagram where on the vertical axis we measure marginal utility and on the horizontal axis we measure the quantity. So each unit, when each unit increases, we can see what happens. The marginal utility curve will be a negative slope curve, because we have been discussing that marginal utility diminishes. And in such a case, when you go on increasing a unit of the commodity, the area under the marginal utility curve will represent the total utility that the consumer is deriving. So under each unit, we can find out the area under the curve for each unit, and we see that the first rectangle covers more area, because even though for all of the rectangles the breadth is the same, the height varies. The breadth represents 1 unit of the commodity, whereas the height represents the marginal utility. So marginal utility into the quantity purchased will give us total utility. And from the chart you can see that as we move from the left to the right, the areas of the rectangles are going on decreasing. So from this, what do we find? We find that when people are putting the commodity to lesser and lesser important uses, they are bound to have lesser and lesser additional satisfaction. That is one thing that we learned. The second thing is that marginal utility diminishes, but in the initial stages it is positive, and at some point it may become 0. That is where no additional satisfaction is derived from the additional unit that the person has consumed. And if he goes on consuming beyond that point also, then marginal utility becomes negative. So he has disutility. So marginal utility diminishes, but initially it is positive. Subsequently, it may become 0 and then go on to become negative. So, this can be explained with the help of a table. In the above table that you can see, you have 3 columns. In the first column, we have slices of bread. In the second column, we have total utility, and in the third column, we have marginal utility. The slices of bread in the first column increase from 0 to 7, and the corresponding amount of total utility and marginal utility are also depicted in the table. When no slice is consumed, total utility is 0 and marginal utility also is 0. When the first slice is consumed, total utility is 15 and marginal utility, that is the additional utility, also is 15. When the second unit is consumed, total utility increases to 27, and that means that the marginal utility is 27 minus 15, which is 12. So, what we see here is that the second unit has given lesser additional utility compared to the first one. The first slice gave him 15 additional units of satisfaction, whereas the second slice gave him just 12 utils of or additional utils of satisfaction. If he goes on to have the third slice, then the total from all the 3 slices increases to 37, and the marginal utility in the third column will be just 10, that is 37 minus 27, and so on. When you go down, when he consumes more and more, for example, when he consumes the 4th unit, the total utility increases to 45, thereby marginal utility decreases only to 8, and for the 5th unit there is no additional satisfaction, so it continues to remain at 45, total utility continues to remain at 45, and marginal utility becomes 0. And if he goes on consuming beyond that, the 6th unit will result in total utility decreasing to 40, and therefore you can see that this would mean that marginal utility has become negative, it has become minus 5, and the 7th unit in the same fashion would decrease total utility to 30, where marginal utility further decreases to minus 10. And so this table goes to prove that marginal utility diminishes as more and more is consumed, and initially it is positive, then it may become 0, and if consumption continues it may also become negative, leading to disutility. So, this law is very important because it helps us to understand why price and the quantity purchased have an inverse relationship. When a person gets more and more of a commodity, he gets lesser and lesser additional satisfaction from it, and therefore he is willing to pay a lower price. So, when the quantity is increasing, the price is decreasing, and this is what the law tries to explain. So, what we have found out here is that marginal utility derived by a consumer is related to the quantity that he consumes, but as the quantity increases, marginal utility does not increase proportionately, and therefore we can say that total utility increases as consumption increases, but it increases at a diminishing rate, and therefore marginal utility turns out to be a negative curve. Now, this law is based upon certain assumptions. For example, Boulding says that whenever a good is consumed, other goods remaining constant, then the additional satisfaction derived from the variant good goes on diminishing. But the assumptions are very important here to understand. The first assumption that comes out of this is that we are assuming that the quantities of other goods are remaining constant. So, that is a very, very important assumption. Then there are other assumptions also. For example, we are assuming that consumers are rational. So, what is a rational consumer? In economics, a rational consumer or a wise consumer always tries to maximize his satisfaction. Of course, the meaning of rationality would change if we take ethics. In ethics, a person who is wise would be willing to sacrifice his satisfaction or his happiness for another person's happiness. But economics assumes that a rational person is a person who tries to maximize his own satisfaction, and therefore rationality of a consumer is something that is assumed here. In addition to this, it is assumed that utility can be measured cardinally, that is in absolute terms. Utility can be measured in absolute terms. For example, we can say from say 1 unit of some commodity, how much of satisfaction we derive. And of course, this can be, even though utility is a qualitative or psychological phenomenon, it is indirectly done by trying to see what a consumer is willing to pay for the commodity. If he is willing to pay a higher price, it means that he is getting more utility from that commodity, and if he is willing to pay a lower price, it shows that he is deriving a lower amount of satisfaction from that commodity. And therefore, to measure utility, it is very difficult to measure it directly, but we do it indirectly through the price that a person is willing to pay for a commodity. And so, we make some sort of a scale where we assume that, say, if it is a very cheap commodity, we may take each 5 paise that he is willing to pay in addition is equal to 1 util of satisfaction. Or if it is a very costly item like a refrigerator, we might say for each 100 rupees that he is willing to pay more for the commodity, he is getting 1 util of satisfaction. So, there is a scope here for individuals to be different. So, in other words, there could be some amount of subjectivity. One person may make one scale, whereas another person may make some other scale. But then, even though there is subjectivity in measuring this utility, on the whole, the law will stand that no matter how you measure or whatever scale you choose, you will find that as people consume more and more of a commodity, they will get lesser and lesser of satisfaction from it. And so, the law of diminishing marginal utility stands through this example. Now, the other assumptions that we have, utility is independent, utilities are independent. By saying that utilities are independent, now we know that many items are consumed by the consumer, and if the satisfaction that he derives from one commodity affects another commodity's satisfaction, or the satisfaction derived from another commodity, then there would be a problem in trying to measure utility. But to make it convenient, in fact in the real world utilities are dependent on each other, but for easy understanding it is assumed that utilities are independent. The satisfaction derived from one commodity does not influence the satisfaction that we derive from another commodity. So, the commodities are, in the sense, they are independent and they do not influence each other when the consumer consumes them. Then the other assumption is that although this law operates in the case of commodities, it does not operate in the case of money. This is because to measure utility, as I said earlier on, we consider the price that the person is willing to pay for it. So, in other words, we are using money to measure utility, and whenever we are using any measure, that measure should be invariant, just as a meter stick is invariant, whether it is cold weather or hot weather or whatever weather you measure 1 meter of cloth, it will always be 1 meter, it should be invariant. In the same manner, here because we are using money as a measuring rod, then money itself should be invariant, and so it is assumed that the utility of money is constant, the marginal utility of money is constant. In other words, the law of diminishing marginal utility operates in the case of goods, whereas it does not operate in the case of money. But there are arguments that this law operates even in the case of money. For example, if a person has more money in his pocket and a beggar comes to him and asks him for 1 rupee, he would be willing to part with that 1 rupee. But if he has just a few rupees, 5 or 10 rupees in his pocket, and a beggar comes and asks him for 1 rupee, he may not be willing to part with it. And so this shows that when a person has more money in his pocket, he gives less importance to each rupee, whereas when he has lesser money in his pocket, he gives more importance for each rupee. So here you can understand that utility is something that is connected with the mind. It is the value that a consumer attributes to it and not the true value of it. So this theory, or any theory in economics, depends on certain assumptions, and only under these assumptions or these conditions that are set forth, the law operates. If these conditions do not exist, then the law will not exist. Let us briefly summarize what we have discussed today. We are trying to understand utility analysis or cardinal utility analysis more clearly, and we have taken up the law of diminishing marginal utility for discussion. Then we tried to use some illustrations to explain this, and then we tried to bring out what are all the assumptions under which this theory stands. So now let me give you 2 questions for your assignment. The first question is, what is marginal utility? Explain the law of diminishing marginal utility. The second question is, explain some of the important uses of the law of diminishing marginal utility. The third question is, critically examine the assumptions of the law of diminishing marginal utility. Now, for the references, you have a number of books that are prescribed by the UGC, so those books can be referred, but 2 other books also can be referred if you can get hold of them. Number 1, Principles of Economics by N. Gregory Mankiw, and number 2, Microeconomics by Pindick